Long before modern refrigerators kept our milk cold and leftovers safe, medieval kitchens had to find clever ways to preserve food, sometimes for months at a time. Without electricity, ice machines, or sealed packaging, survival depended on knowledge, technique, and the natural environment. In this video, we're diving into the fascinating world of medieval food preservation, where necessity gave rise to ingenuity, and where the difference between life and death could depend on a well-salted slab of meat. Salt was more than just a seasoning in the medieval world. It was a lifeline. Before refrigeration, there were few resources as vital to survival as salt. In fact, it was so essential that entire economies were built around it. Wars were fought over salt routes, taxes were imposed on it, and cities sprang up where salt could be harvested or traded. But in the kitchen, salt's true power lay in its ability to preserve food, especially meat and fish, for months, sometimes even years. The science of salting was understood through experience, trial and error, and oral tradition passed down through generations. Medieval cooks and households used salt to draw moisture out of food through a process known as osmosis. Without moisture, bacteria, especially the kind that causes food to rot, could not survive. This made salt a powerful antimicrobial agent long before anyone understood the concept of microbes. The process began with the sourcing of salt, which wasn't always easy or affordable. There were two main types: sea salt, which was evaporated from seawater in coastal areas, and rock salt, mined from salt deposits inland. The purity and grain size varied, and so did the results. Wealthier households might have had access to cleaner, more refined salt, while common folk used coarser varieties. In some communities, salt was so precious that it was rationed, stored securely, or even used as currency. Once acquired, salt was typically used in one of two ways: dry salting or brining. In dry salting, slabs of meat were packed in layers of salt inside barrels, crates, or ceramic containers. Each piece was completely covered to ensure no moisture was left unextracted. Over the course of days or weeks, the meat would shrink, harden, and darken in color. The salt would be replaced periodically, and the meat might be turned to ensure even curing. In coastal regions, where fish was more abundant, this same technique was used on large catches of herring, cod, and other sea life. Salted cod, or bacalhau, became a dietary staple in many parts of Europe. Brining, the other major method, involved soaking meat or fish in heavily salted water. This process was sometimes combined with herbs or spices for flavor and antimicrobial support. Brine had the advantage of evenly reaching every surface of the food, reducing the risk of spoilage. Large vats or barrels were kept in cool cellars or shaded outdoor areas, and the brine was periodically checked for contamination. In especially cold climates, the brine itself could partially freeze, giving the preservation process an added edge. Salting wasn't just a way to store food, it was a strategy for survival across seasons. During times of abundance, like the autumn harvest or after a successful hunt, families would salt and store large quantities of meat to prepare for the long winter ahead. Monasteries and castles often had entire rooms or basements devoted to the storage of salted provisions, stocked up in preparation for sieges, snowstorms, or famine. In remote villages where fresh supplies were rare in winter, salted meat might be the only protein source for months. However, salting came with its challenges. The taste of heavily salted meat was often overpowering and required special preparation before it could be consumed. Most commonly, the meat would be soaked in water for hours, sometimes overnight, to leach out the excess salt. Boiling was another common step to soften the meat and make it more palatable. Even then, the taste could remain intense, so herbs and spices were added whenever possible, though these too were expensive and not always available. Despite the taste, the trade-off was worth it. Salted food was reliable, safe, relatively speaking, and efficient. It allowed medieval people to store and transport perishable goods across long distances. Sailors embarking on sea voyages would carry salted pork and fish as primary food sources. Armies on the move brought barrels of salted rations to feed their soldiers. Salted meat also became central to fasting and religious practices. When fresh meat was restricted, preserved fish took its place. Salt was more than just a tool. It was a bridge between nature's perishability and humanity's desire for control. In the medieval kitchen, salt meant stability in an unstable world. It was a quiet guardian in the pantry, silently preserving not just food, but the hopes of those who needed it to see another season. While salting was a cornerstone of medieval food preservation, smoking brought both practicality and depth. Smoking not only extended the shelf life of food, but also added rich layers of flavor that became synonymous with rustic medieval cuisine. To the modern mind, smoking might seem like a culinary luxury, but in the medieval kitchen, it was a matter of survival. The origins of smoking food stretch back to ancient times, but in the medieval world, it evolved into a daily necessity. Smoke acted as a natural preservative, preventing bacterial growth through a combination of dehydration and the antimicrobial properties of the smoke itself. When meat or fish was smoked, the moisture content was reduced, and a chemical coating formed on the surface that helped ward off mold, bacteria, and insects. There were generally two types of smoking used in the medieval period: hot smoking and cold smoking. Hot smoking involved cooking the meat over a low flame, often over several hours, which simultaneously cooked and preserved it. Cold smoking, by contrast, was a slower process that exposed meat to smoke without cooking it. This required the fire to be kept at a low, smoldering temperature, with the smoke funneled through a chamber or tunnel to a separate smoking area. This method could last days or even weeks, depending on the size and type of food being preserved. Families often used the hearth in their homes for smoking. In rural cottages and peasant dwellings, food was sometimes hung from wooden beams above the fire, where it would be exposed to smoke continuously. These meats might remain suspended for weeks, slowly absorbing the smoke as they dried out. In wealthier homes or monasteries, dedicated smokehouses were built, small structures with controlled airflow, designed specifically for curing large batches of meat or fish. The smokehouse was often a sacred space of sorts, carefully maintained, and its knowledge passed down like a treasured family recipe. What got smoked varied depending on region and resources. Pork was particularly well suited to smoking and became one of the most commonly preserved meats. Hams, sausages, and bacon strips were hung in thick clouds of smoke until they took on a deep color and dense texture. These products could then be sliced thin and eaten slowly throughout the season. In areas near rivers or coasts, fish was smoked in large quantities. Trout, herring, and eel were frequent subjects of smoking, allowing entire villages to survive long winters on preserved catches from earlier in the year. The process wasn't just functional, it became ritualistic. Timing was everything. Meat needed to be salted first, then allowed to air dry slightly before being introduced to smoke. The type of wood used also mattered. Different woods provided different flavors, and many medieval people had a preference. Oak, beech, and apple wood were particularly popular. Each type of wood gave off its own blend of aromatic compounds, and over time, regional preferences emerged. In some places, certain smoked meats were so prized that they became valuable trade goods, passed through markets, and over borders as delicacies. But like all preservation methods, smoking required careful balance. Too much heat, and the food would cook and spoil instead of preserving. Too much moisture, and mold could develop. Smokehouses needed constant monitoring. Ventilation was crucial, and fire control was an art form. Children were often trained from an early age to recognize the smell and look of perfectly smoked meat. It wasn't just a job. It was a survival skill. Even socially, smoked food became a sign of preparedness and respectability. A well-stocked smokehouse was a symbol of a household's planning and foresight. It meant that a family could feed guests, survive harsh weather, and share with neighbors if needed. In castles and estates, entire teams were dedicated to curing and smoking food year-round, ensuring the larders never ran dry. The taste of smoked meat also influenced the culture's relationship with food. It became more than preservation. It was culinary identity. Recipes developed to pair with smoked meat, hearty stews, spiced broths, and thick breads that complemented the rich, savory flavors. Even religious fasting days, which prohibited fresh meat, often allowed preserved fish, and smoked varieties became a staple during such times. In many ways, smoking was one of the earliest forms of food engineering, transforming perishables into long-lasting, deeply flavored staples. It was the bridge between season and scarcity, between fresh kill and winter survival. In the world of medieval kitchens, smoke wasn't just rising from the fire. It was a whisper of knowledge, of resourcefulness, and of life preserved through fire and air. While salt and smoke were critical tools in the medieval kitchen, perhaps one of the most ancient and universally accessible preservation methods was drying. Deceptively simple, drying relied on the natural elements, sun, wind, and time, to remove the moisture that microorganisms needed to grow. And in a world without refrigeration, mastering the art of drying could mean the difference between feast and famine. Drying was a method that required patience, attentiveness, and the right environmental conditions. The goal was straightforward: extract as much water from food as possible, leaving behind a product that would not spoil for months. The earliest humans dried food out of necessity, laying strips of meat or pieces of fruit on sun-warmed rocks. In the medieval world, this technique became more refined, forming an essential part of seasonal routines and food preparation cycles. One of the main advantages of drying was its accessibility. It didn't require expensive ingredients like salt or tools like smokehouses. All that was needed was airflow, warmth, and time. This made drying especially popular among poorer households or in remote villages where resources were scarce. Families could hang food from rafters, stretch it across wooden racks, or lay it on flat stones and wooden planks in sunny courtyards. In many regions, specially constructed drying racks were permanent fixtures in homes or outbuildings, made from wood and netting to allow for air circulation while keeping insects away. Meat and fish were common subjects for drying. Strips of venison, rabbit, or poultry would be cut thin and hung high in dry, breezy places, often near the hearth, where the warmth helped accelerate the process. Fish like herring, cod, and eel were cleaned, gutted, and splayed out to dry in the sun or cold wind. In northern regions, especially in Scandinavia and parts of the British Isles, fish would be left to dry for weeks, hardening into dense, shelf-stable forms. Stockfish, for example, became a vital part of trade and diet, offering a tough but nourishing meal that could survive sea voyages and bitter winters alike. But drying wasn't limited to protein. It played a crucial role in preserving plant-based foods as well. Fruits like apples, plums, grapes, and pears were sliced thin and laid out in baskets or on cloth-covered boards to dry under the sun. These dried fruits could be used throughout the winter, either eaten as snacks or added to porridge and bread for extra sweetness and nutrition. Herbs, oregano, thyme, sage, and others were tied in bundles and hung upside down in kitchens or storerooms, ready to flavor meals or act as medicine when fresh plants were no longer available. Vegetables, though harder to dry due to their water content, were sometimes sliced and hung, especially onions, garlic, and leeks. In some cases, vegetables were partially cooked or blanched before being set out to dry. Mushrooms, a valuable foraged good in medieval Europe, were highly prized when dried, as they retained their umami flavor and could be rehydrated in soups and stews. In colder climates, nature offered another solution: freeze drying. Though they didn't call it that, medieval people in alpine or Nordic regions used the frigid night air to slowly remove moisture from food. Meat or milk products might be left outside or in unheated structures during the winter, where freezing temperatures and low humidity worked together to dehydrate them gradually. This natural freeze-drying was especially useful in areas where sunny days were scarce. There were also communal aspects to drying. During the harvest season, entire villages might engage in drying food together. Large communal drying frames were set up, and the sight of herbs fluttering in the breeze or fruits glinting in the sun was a signal of abundance being stored away. Drying was a visual ritual, a signal of prosperity, preparation, and continuity. It was a way of saying, "We are ready. Winter will not catch us unprepared." Of course, drying wasn't foolproof. The process could be interrupted by unexpected rain, which could rot food before it was fully dehydrated. Insects and rodents were constant threats, requiring vigilance and protective measures. Sometimes, dried food would become too dry, rock hard and nearly inedible without soaking or boiling. But medieval cooks adapted. They learned how to rehydrate dried goods by simmering them slowly or pounding them into powders and pastes to add to other dishes. Even the scraps of dried vegetables or bits of jerky could be tossed into soups to stretch meals further. The textures and flavors that came from drying also began to influence cuisine itself. Chewy dried apples and plums added contrast to otherwise soft bread. Dried herbs gave depth to basic grain dishes. Dried meats offered an intensity that fresh cuts couldn't match, and all of these foods traveled well, essential for merchants, pilgrims, soldiers, and explorers. Dried food became portable nutrition, carried in sacks, pouches, and barrels across continents and seas. Ultimately, drying was more than just a method. It was a relationship with the elements. It required a keen awareness of weather, a respect for time, and a faith in nature's slow but effective processes. In the medieval kitchen, drying meant independence from spoilage, a way to beat time itself. It turned fleeting abundance into lasting sustenance, and in doing so, became one of the quiet, enduring miracles of daily life. While salt, smoke, and drying were vital to medieval food preservation, another set of techniques offered both protection and transformation: pickling and fermentation. These methods didn't just keep food from spoiling, they changed it, evolved it, and in some cases, improved it. In an age where the boundaries between food and medicine were often blurred, the acidic bite of a pickled vegetable or the tangy richness of fermented grain was more than culinary, it was alchemical. Pickling, at its core, is the preservation of food in an acidic environment, most commonly vinegar or brine. The acid prevents the growth of harmful bacteria, keeping the food safe for extended periods. While vinegar as we know it today wasn't always widely available, the medieval world had many ways to create the necessary acidic environments. Sour wine, aged ale, and fermented whey from cheese making were all used as base liquids for pickling. In some cases, simply fermenting vegetables in salt water was enough to trigger the lactic acid fermentation process, which preserved the food and gave it its distinctive sour taste. Vegetables were among the most commonly pickled items. Cabbage, onions, carrots, and cucumbers were sliced or left whole, packed into ceramic or wooden jars, and covered with brine. Over days or weeks, they transformed. The salt encouraged the growth of beneficial bacteria, like lactobacillus, which produced acid and kept spoilage at bay. Sauerkraut, for example, wasn't just a tangy dish served on the side. It was a nutritional powerhouse in the winter months, when fresh vegetables were scarce and scurvy was a constant threat. The vitamin C and probiotics in fermented cabbage kept people alive and healthier than they might have realized. But pickling didn't stop at vegetables. Eggs, fish, and even fruits were preserved using similar techniques. In regions close to the sea, herring and other fish were layered with spices and submerged in sour solutions, making them both transportable and long-lasting. Pickled eggs were a common sight in taverns and households alike. Shelled, boiled, and steeped in spiced vinegar until they took on a rubbery texture and tangy flavor. Even fruits like pears and plums might be pickled with honey and vinegar, producing sweet and sour delicacies that could complement roasted meats or serve as standalone treats. Fermentation, meanwhile, opened up an entirely different world. Unlike pickling, which often relied on acidic environments created from outside sources, fermentation allowed nature to do the heavy lifting. Through carefully controlled rot, foods and drinks transformed, richer in flavor, longer lasting, and often more nutritious. Bread, beer, and cheese were the holy trinity of medieval fermentation. Each relied on wild yeasts or bacteria to convert sugars into alcohol, gas, or acid. Sourdough bread, for example, was made with wild yeast caught from the air and nurtured in a starter, a living, bubbling mixture of flour and water. Every loaf of bread carried the signature of its environment, the flavor of the local microbes, the temperature of the kitchen, the habits of the baker. These sourdough loaves lasted longer than unfermented breads and resisted mold more effectively. Beer and ale were another staple, consumed daily by both peasants and nobility. Water was often unsafe to drink due to contamination, so fermented beverages were a safer and tastier alternative. Brewing beer was an intricate process involving malted grains, hot water, fermentation, and flavoring agents like hops or herbs. Though monasteries became known as centers of brewing excellence, many rural households made their own versions with whatever grains and ingredients were on hand. Beer could be thick and hearty, more of a food than a drink, and provided calories, hydration, and preservation all at once. Cheese, one of the oldest fermented foods, served as a way to preserve milk in a solid form. Through the addition of rennet, milk would curdle, separating into curds and whey. The curds were pressed, salted, and aged in cool, dark spaces. Over time, bacteria and molds transformed the curds into complex cheeses, some soft and tangy, others hard and sharp. A well-aged cheese could last for months, sometimes years, and was a critical protein source when fresh dairy was unavailable. Fermentation also produced medicines. Mead, a honey-based alcoholic drink, was sometimes infused with herbs for its supposed healing properties. Fermented herbal tonics and vinegars were used both as food and as remedies. Even kombucha-like drinks, made by fermenting sweetened teas or fruit juices, found a place in various cultures, though they weren't always named as such. There was a magical quality to fermentation, foods left to sit, hidden from light and air, only to emerge changed, improved, and preserved. But it was also risky. If the wrong molds developed, or if the balance of bacteria tipped unfavorably, entire batches of food could be spoiled. This made experience crucial. Medieval cooks and brewers paid close attention to smells, colors, textures, and timing. A good fermenter was as valuable as a skilled warrior, perhaps even more so during times of scarcity. Fermented and pickled foods also carried symbolic weight. They represented transformation, patience, and the wisdom of timing. They allowed summer's bounty to stretch into the bleakness of winter. They turned waste into wealth, old milk into cheese, leftover vegetables into sauerkraut, surplus grain into ale. They showed that with the right knowledge and care, even decay could be useful, even rot could nourish. In the medieval kitchen, pickling and fermentation were more than survival techniques. They were acts of creation, deeply rooted in tradition, observation, and respect for nature's strange and wonderful processes. Through brine and bacteria, vinegar and yeast, medieval people preserved not only their food, but their culture, their stories, and their resilience. In a world without electricity, compressors, or climate-controlled pantries, medieval people turned to one of the oldest and most reliable forms of food preservation, the earth itself. Root cellars and natural cold storage spaces served as the medieval equivalent of a refrigerator, using the stable, cool temperatures found underground or within thick stone walls to slow down the decay of perishable goods. These methods were incredibly effective, sustainable, and accessible to people across all levels of society, from peasants in rural villages to noble families in fortified manors. The logic behind root cellars was simple yet brilliant. Underground, temperatures remain relatively constant throughout the year, cool in the summer and above freezing in the winter. This steady environment helped prevent food from freezing or rotting, offering a dependable way to store produce and preserved items for long periods. Medieval people knew, through trial and necessity, how to harness this natural insulation to their advantage. Root cellars took many forms, depending on geography, climate, and wealth. Some were literal holes dug into the ground, lined with stone or timber, covered with a wooden hatch or earth mound to keep out light and moisture. Others were more elaborate subterranean chambers, often located beneath houses or outbuildings, with steps leading down into cool, dark spaces. In castles and monasteries, these storage areas were often integrated into the architecture, protected by thick walls and sometimes reinforced with iron doors to keep out animals and thieves. Within these cellars, food was carefully organized. Root vegetables, like carrots, parsnips, beets, onions, garlic, and turnips, were among the most commonly stored items. These crops, harvested in late summer or autumn, were hardy by nature and well suited to underground storage. Some were layered in straw or sand to prevent moisture loss and keep them from touching one another, which could trigger rot. Others were hung in bunches from beams to allow air to circulate around them. Apples and pears were also stored in cellars, selected carefully for storage based on ripeness and skin integrity. The fruit was often wrapped individually in cloth or straw and placed on wooden shelves, turned occasionally to check for soft spots. One spoiled apple could indeed spoil the bunch, and medieval people were intimately familiar with the truth of that old saying. Preserved goods, such as jars of pickled vegetables, crocks of salted meats, and wheels of aged cheese, also found their home in these cool underground sanctuaries. Ale, wine, and vinegar were stored in barrels or ceramic jugs, kept at a temperature that preserved their flavor and prevented spoilage. Even butter, sealed in clay pots or covered with salted water, could last much longer in a root cellar than it ever could at room temperature. In colder regions or highland areas, natural caves or stone structures were sometimes used in place of dug cellars. Snow and ice collected during the winter months were occasionally packed into these spaces, helping to keep the temperature even lower well into the summer. In certain cases, medieval people would insulate these icy stores with sawdust or straw to slow the melting process. Though true ice houses wouldn't become common until the Renaissance and beyond, these early cold rooms were a testament to the ingenuity and deep understanding of natural cycles that medieval communities possessed. Storage was not just about keeping food cold, it was about creating the right conditions for longevity. Humidity had to be managed. Too much moisture and mold or mildew would grow. Too little, and root vegetables would shrivel and become inedible. Vents were sometimes built into root cellars to allow for air circulation, and floors might be made of gravel or packed earth to absorb excess moisture. Shelves and bins were arranged to separate items based on their storage needs. For example, potatoes were kept away from onions, as the gases released by the latter could cause the former to sprout or rot prematurely. These spaces also had a seasonal rhythm. In spring, the root cellar would begin to empty as winter supplies dwindled. By summer, it might be used to keep dairy and fresh produce cool, though supplies would be more limited. Come autumn, it would be restocked in a frenzy of preservation and storage, filled with the bounty of harvest before the first frost hit. The root cellar was not just a static room, it was a living extension of the medieval kitchen, pulsing with the seasons and the labor of the people who maintained it. The root cellar also carried cultural significance. It represented foresight, stability, and the ability to provide. A well-stocked cellar was a point of pride and a symbol of household competence. Parents taught their children not just how to cook or farm, but how to inspect stored food, rotate supplies, and prepare for lean times. In times of famine or siege, the contents of the cellar could be the difference between starvation and survival. For communities without access to ideal storage conditions, alternative methods were developed. In northern climates, food might be stored in wooden huts, partially buried in the snow or frozen ground. In milder regions, food was kept in shaded wells or suspended in ceramic pots, placed in flowing water to stay cool. These were all attempts to replicate the stable temperatures and protective environment that the earth naturally provided. Even the architecture of medieval homes reflected this knowledge. Kitchens and storage rooms were often built on the north-facing side of the house, away from direct sunlight. Windows were kept small, or absent altogether to prevent heat from entering. Stone and clay materials were used for their insulating properties. In every detail, the medieval home was shaped by an intuitive understanding of food preservation and environmental adaptation. Ultimately, root cellars and cold storage practices weren't merely survival tactics. They were part of a sophisticated, time-tested system of seasonal living. They reveal a society that was deeply attuned to nature, to cycles of abundance and scarcity, and to the importance of careful planning. In a world where every meal depended on yesterday's preparation, these cool, quiet spaces stood as monuments to resilience, knowledge, and the enduring human desire to nourish and protect.